welcome back to another episode of Alter Your Health Live, your source of information and inspiration to promote the holistic transformation of your health and the health of our planet. I'm your host, Dr. Benjamin Alter.
And I'm your co-host, Dr. Susanna Alter.
And thanks again for being with us. We are diving into a new topic, something that I put a little poll out on Instagram for topics and people that you guys are interested in getting on the podcast. And one thing that came up that seemed relevant was antibiotics and prebiotics and probiotics and all that kind of stuff. So we're going to dive into that here today. So feel free, if you are on the live on Facebook or Instagram, feel free to write a question. We'll try to get to it, but we're going to tell you about antibiotics, probiotics, prebiotics, and kind of a little bit about gut health as well, because that's kind of what we're pointing to with all of these things.
Yeah. So Ben has like a really awesome antibiotic story. So I think we should start off with that.
Well, we both have, I think everyone in this world has an antibiotic story, right?
Yeah, it's true.
Antibiotics are lifesavers, and that we don't want to stray away from that fact that antibiotics save lives, and that's why they have been put on this planet by scientists to help save lives. And yeah, my life was saved by antibiotics, or
a few times.
I mean, more accurately, the first time that really antibiotics came into my life in a strong way was when I was traveling abroad in India. I developed a severe infection on my foot, and it got really bad, super painful, and I ended up actually cutting my travels short, and I decided to come home back to the US to have treatment. And by the time I changed my flight, got to the airport, got off the airport, my foot was in such severe pain I couldn't walk, and I had a red streak up my leg, and everyone in the medical field knows what a red streak means.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, so I had the infection had made its way into my bloodstream, and I went straight to the emergency room, was put on IV antibiotics, and I was told that, if I had waited maybe a day longer, who knows, I would have maybe lost my foot. So that was just the first time I was on IV antibiotics.
Yeah.
So I have taken antibiotics in my veins, in systemic antibiotics in IV form, and they have saved my life. So Thank you, antibiotics. How about your story, Dr. Susanna?
My story also happened in South Asia. When I traveled abroad to Nepal, I, within the first 2 or 3 weeks, came down with a GI bug, which is very common. They call it Delhi belly when you travel to India or Nepal and get these, infections. And so I was in a program at the time. I was in college, and the instructor said, "Oh, there's an international clinic. Why don't you go there?" And so they gave me some antibiotics, and I took them, and I was on my way. And then about 2 weeks later, I got another GI bug. And so I went to the international clinic, and they gave me another course of antibiotics, and then I was on my way. And then about 2 weeks later, I came down with another GI bug, and I went to the clinic, and they gave me another course of antibiotics, and I was on my way. And so I counted, by the end of the time I was in Nepal, I took about 6 or 7 courses of antibiotics within the course of 3 or 4 months. And at the time, I didn't think I was doing any harm to my body at all. I figured, all right, this is the treatment, and I'm just, I just happen to be catching all these GI bugs. But in reality, in retrospect, I really wish someone had told me about some of the side effects of antibiotics, because it ultimately, I think that time in Nepal really did damage my gut. And a few months later, by the time I had returned back to the US, I was starting to manifest more kind of chronic symptoms, both GI and also systemic symptoms. So, so kind of 2 different stories here showing the life-saving effects of antibiotics and also the detrimental effects if these antibiotics aren't used wisely and are kind of abused.
Yeah, so it sounds like we both have, my side of the story is kind of the acute life-saving, side of the story, and Susanna's sharing kind of a chronic side effect issue with antibiotics, and this can be said with any drug or anything that we take into our body. There's acute effects and then there's chronic effects. So I want to talk a little bit about one of the chronic effects of antibiotics in our culture, and it's a real issue, and that is antibiotic resistant infections, which is becoming more and more of a thing in our world. And the reason why it's becoming more and more of a thing is because infections are treated unnecessarily with antibiotics. We are giving out, we being the society, the medical community, are giving out lots of antibiotics for things like viral infections and self-limiting conditions that don't need treatment. But the real main cause of antibiotic resistance is actually the amount of antibiotics that are given to animals in the factory farming business. And those animals, I think I heard a statistic, something like 80% of the world's antibiotics actually go to animals, not humans. So animals are getting the bulk of the antibiotics that are used in our world today. And that's to prevent the occurrence of prevent infection, of course, but antibiotics also stimulate growth in these animals. So there's multiple reasons why antibiotics are used in factory farming. But in any case, when the animals are shot up with these antibiotics and then we eat the antibiotics, we actually cultivate antibiotic resistant organisms in our body and in the world. So that's really the big picture chronic epidemic that we are kind of on the breach of, is this huge antibiotic resistant organism that is lurking in the shadows. And we and the rest of this talk is obviously going to be about how to maintain health without the need of antibiotics, but obviously knowing that antibiotics are reserved for these kind of life-threatening illnesses and infections like Susanna and I shared with you in our personal stories.
Well, Ben's story, not mine. I probably would have cleared my infection over time.
Yeah.
But yours was, at the point where antibiotics were definitely needed.
Yeah. So when are antibiotics really needed? That is really $1 million question. And I think that they're obviously needed to prevent life-threatening illness, and they are needed to the degree that we have other tools in our toolboxes to treat and support people in their healing. And the other tools in the toolbox are obviously all sorts of other immune stimulating foods and herbs and things like that. And if a doctor or a medical professional doesn't have these tools in their toolbox or doesn't have access to them or isn't confident in them, then they are more likely to rely on these sort of antibiotic tools that have severe side effects, both acute and chronic, for ourselves and the world. So, do you want to talk about the kind of the natural antibiotics and kind of those tools in the toolbox?
Yeah,
Okay.
sure. Well, yeah, there are so many herbs that are antibiotic, and also usually they're antimicrobial, so they have a broad spectrum. They're also usually just immune boosting in nature, so they kind of hit a lot of birds with one stone, which is really great. Yeah. And so these herbs that come to mind are berberine, oil of oregano, raw garlic, hydrastis, golden seal. These are, and also elderberry is a strong antiviral, but that's kind of a different topic. but so many herbs. I mean, that's just like a small handful of all the antibiotic herbs there are on the planet. And like what Ben was saying, naturopathic doctors are more comfortable kind of employing these methods in cases where someone is dealing with usually an acute viral infection, and they need a little bit of support to clear the infection on their own. And that, the way that we see it is that, you know, in these cases where strong antibiotics aren't needed and we use these herbs instead, we're ultimately kind of taking away from this whole antibiotic resistant issue. Because one of the biggest issues is if you look at kids with ear infections or sinus infections, where a lot of times they're actually viral in nature, but they're still treated with antibiotics. That's just an example of kind of the overprescribing of antibiotics that's currently going on in our medical system.
Yeah, and that's just kind of in general pointing to a style of medicine that is, I think I like to call it kind of cover your ass medicine. CYA, I think they say, just kind of like shooting the issue with a shotgun and just, like covering your ass with regardless of what's really going on. You're just going to like throw the big guns in and just knock down the whole organism just to fight a little virus. And obviously there's a whole nother way of approaching the issue, which is, I like to call it more vitalistic, supporting the human being in cultivating a resilient immune system so that we can naturally handle these kind of organisms that we're constantly inundated with in our natural world. So the great thing about the natural antibiotics is that, first of all, they don't really have side effects. They're not going to throw off our microbiome, which is kind of like the next topic we're going to get into. And also they work in synergy. And so, for example, they don't only support the immune system in fighting bacteria, they do so many other things that are also important in all aspects of a healthy immune system and healthy circulatory system. And so a lot of people like to study these kind of natural antibiotics in kind of a reductionistic matter to figure out what exactly they're doing. But more as we do that, as we do these studies and find more information out, we realize that these kind of natural antibiotics that have been used for millennia, right, since the beginning of medicine, these sort of natural antibiotics have such a complex web of synergistic effects that affect the whole host, the whole human being.
Exactly.
So they're cool.
They're cool.
And the reason why we're kind of talking about this now is because we are getting into the cold flu season kind of thing. So we're going to have an episode probably in the future talking about other aspects of really cultivating a resilient immune system in the winter months. But now we're just really covering the topics of antibiotics, probiotics, prebiotics, and elevated biotics, which is what we're going to be talking about from here on forth, unless you have anything else to say about antibiotics.
No, let's move forward. And it's perfect because we actually had a question, and it says, do we need to take probiotics on a regular basis, and how do we know we need them?
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks for setting us up with that question. Susanna, do you want to take this one?
Well, yeah. First, I'd like to start off by explaining what a probiotic is.
That's good.
For those of you who don't know, probiotics are encapsulated.
Well, not always. Sometimes they're liquid. Sometimes they're in food.
That's true. That's true. But they're called probiotics because they are beneficial forms of bacteria, gut bacteria, because our entire digestive system is
lined with
beneficial bacteria.
Yeah, bacterial organisms.
Yes. And when we take antibiotics, usually it just wipes out a lot of that beneficial bacteria. So the idea of probiotics is that when you take them, they will repopulate your gut and your microbiome, which is really important for so many functions.
Yeah, we're not going to get into that in this talk.
No.
Too much.
Yes. But when you go to the store and you look at the probiotics on the shelf, there are so many different strains. Some of them say they have 1 billion, sometimes it's 50 billion. It's like there's just endless options for probiotics.
Mm-hmm.
So,
hey Winnie.
What's up, girl? So how do we know if we need probiotics? Well,
so the most common thing that doctors do, both conventional and naturopathic doctors, is if they give a course of antibiotics, they will often give a course of probiotics concurrently, and they aren't to be taken at the same time in that case. But the idea or the theory is that you're wiping out some bacteria with these antibiotics, so you're going to throw in some new guys to maintain a healthy gut.
Mm-hmm.
And it turns out it doesn't really work that way for a number of reasons. In general, probiotics that we take in our mouth are totally digested and eliminated and killed by our digestive system, which is the function of a healthy digestive system. The hydrochloric acid in the stomach just kind of wipes out most of the bacteria. Digestive enzymes it makes it really difficult for all of these organisms to survive. And that's the point of a healthy digestive system. So there are some spore-formed probiotics that are more common nowadays, that there is some evidence that those spores allow the microbe to make it all the way down to the small intestine and large intestine to populate that area of the gut, which is really the goal. But even so, I think it's really not the smartest thing to rely on probiotics specifically, because it's like going to the store and saying, oh, well, that organism sounds like, how do they know that organism should be in my gut? It's like they're kind of cherry picking these different microbes and blending them together, and then they're just making their best guess that this is the population that should be in me. And I don't really like to trust. I don't think we know enough to say what individual microbes you specifically need. So the best way to repopulate the gut and maintain the most optimal biodiversity of your microbiome.
Guess what we're going to say? If you know us.
Well, food.
Diet.
But the food particles that we're talking about, the what we're speaking of when we're talking about food is prebiotics, which is a fancy word for fiber. So prebiotics are the food that the microbes in the gut eat. And when we feed ourselves healthy, diverse arrays of different sorts of fibers from plants, then we are naturally feeding those bacteria in our gut. And those bacteria in our gut actually produce things known as short-chain fatty acids, or butyrate or propionate, different sorts of these short-chain fatty acids are hugely beneficial to our immune system, to the health of our digestive tract. They're anti-cancer. There's so many huge benefits from the short-chain fatty acid production, which is a byproduct of feeding our bacterial colonies in our gut great sources of prebiotic fiber. So that's anyways, so where do probiotics fit into this? Well, I think it's kind of like a lazy shotgun approach to gut health.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, I don't know if I'm going to eat right. I don't know if I'm going to eat the right food. I don't know what food to eat. So I'm just going to trust that company that tells me I should have this amount of this bacteria and put it in my mouth and see what happens. And I think that most of the time, nothing happens. That's in the best case scenario is nothing happens. Yeah.
Yeah. And to piggyback off of what Ben was saying, there's really awesome research that you can look up that shows that people that eat a more diverse diet, and what I mean by that is they eat lots of different fruits and vegetables and high fiber foods, they have a more diverse microbiome. And the more diversity you have in your microbiome, the better your immune system's going to be, the leaner you're going to be, it just goes on and on and on.
On and on.
The happier you'll be. And when you look at people that have a diet that isn't as diverse in fruits and vegetables, they then have lower diversity of microbiome, of organisms in their microbiome, and they tend to be sicker, they tend to be more overweight, they tend to have more chronic diseases. So that is like, I love that research so much.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah, it's really pointing to the fact that food is medicine. Not only is food medicine, but it's the best medicine.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so prebiotics, when people ask me all the time what my favorite probiotic is, and my answer is always prebiotics. My favorite probiotic is prebiotics, which obviously doesn't really make sense. But what I'm really saying is I don't like probiotics. What I really like are prebiotics. And the crazy thing is that you can go to the health food store and buy prebiotics, and a lot of people are pushing these sort of items knowing how beneficial prebiotics are for gut health and for the health of our colonocytes, our enterocytes, the cells that line our gut tract. And but the fact of the matter is you shouldn't be taking prebiotics in a supplement form. You should be taking prebiotics in food form, because that's the way that nature intended. And obviously, when we do that, we are getting all of the micronutrients, macronutrients, fuel that the food has. So let's just get real and eat real food for prebiotics.
Mm-hmm. So ask me a question. Ask me, Susanna, do you like probiotic foods?
Susanna, what about probiotic foods?
I love probiotic foods, mainly because they taste so good. I mean, I love sauerkraut. I love kombucha. And I still think the most important thing is eating a broad diversity of fruits and vegetables. I think that trumps eating, kimchi or sauerkraut every day. But
yeah,
we do both.
We do both. Because we like it. Yeah. But yeah, I don't think it's absolutely critical to anyone's health to have a serving of probiotic foods every day. I think that prebiotics is always the way to go. Lastly, maybe we should get into our new favorite, I've been in love with this next sort of biotic, even before I knew what it was, but it was described by Anthony William, medical medium, elevated biotics.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk about what elevated biotics are?
Yes. So elevated biotics are beneficial bacteria that's found on the fruits and vegetables that are growing locally at your local farm. At the farmer's market, you can find these foods, or even better, in your backyard or front yard. And if you've ever noticed, if you look on like a kale leaf, for example, and you see that kind of like little shine, little silver appearance on it, that's actually, there's good bacteria in there. And it apparently is very resistant and can, like when you eat it, like what we were saying with these other probiotics that you take, they're just completely destroyed in the stomach. But these elevated biotics are resilient enough to be able to populate the gut.
Yeah. And we can get these elevated biotics actually even without a farm or garden in our backyard. We can even get them from sprouting seeds and that sort of thing. Like broccoli sprouts and why am I blanking? Mung bean sprouts and you know.
Yeah.
You know how to sprout stuff. If you don't know how to sprout stuff, Google it and you can start sprouting stuff and you can start getting your elevated biotics. And the reason why I love elevated biotics so much is because before I knew that they were a thing, I remember, eating, being in a farm or garden or whatever and like eating a fresh tomato or fresh kale leaf. And I remember the feeling, not the taste, but the feeling of that amount of life going into my body. And it's indescribable and irreplaceable, I believe. So I think that elevated biotics are always a part of a healthy diet. And it's harder and harder nowadays as we're kind of displaced and separated from our food source. But doing things like sprouting and that sort of in-kitchen farming is great.
And I just remembered,
What?
Ben taught this to me, so I'm gonna let him teach it to you. But what about in the air, in the forest air?
Oh yeah.
All right, explain that.
So another great way to get biotics, which really means life or bacteria, or I don't really know what biotics technically means, but a good way to get these sort of microbes into our body is by taking good cleansing breaths in nature. Because if you think about it, you look out in the air and there are actually microbes everywhere. You could like grab them and like put them in your mouth and eat them.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously we don't need to grab them and eat them like this. We can just breathe and we are getting those beneficial microbes into our system. And they populate our respiratory tract, our digestive tract, our mouth. Every single surface of our body is very much, we are in tune with nature through our microbial system, resonating with the microbial environment of whatever setting that we're in. And which reminds me, maybe we're going to say this.
Probably not.
so there's even some evidence I read somewhere that, if you travel somewhere and go into a hotel room, for example, it can feel a little weird. And it's like an indescribable weird feeling. And one of the reasons for that is that I learned is that our microbial environment and our body is all of a sudden immersed in a new microbial environment that is foreign to us. So that can lead to that can kind of be a shock to the system and can lead to poor sleep and a kind of a depressed immune system just because of that microbial resonance, I guess you could call it.
Oh my gosh, yeah, that totally makes sense. I think of all the times that I traveled to even a different city in the US. Like the first time I went up to Portland, Oregon, I was like, oh, it must be the clouds. I feel so tired. But then when I moved away from Oregon and went to Colorado, which is like sunny mountain land, I had the same weird...
There's kind of that travel hangover. Like that first day, it's like I'm adjusting. And one of the adjusting things is our microbial environment resonating with our new environment. Yeah. Did you want to say one more thing?
Yeah, the thing I wanted to say was the way that we know that this is actually true, or one of the ways we know that it's true that there's, microbes floating around in the air everywhere is because if you know how to make beer, you know that you need yeast to make beer. And there's actually people that will bring beer out into the forest, and I forget what they call it. It's some kind of like wild brew or natural brew.
I haven't heard that.
Yeah, but they allow the natural yeast in the forest to populate in the beer, and then and that's what they use to make the beer. I'm not a beer maker, but
Cool.
There's that example.
So on that note, happy November.
Happy November.
Yeah, and it's November. It's crazy. And hope you guys had a happy Halloween. We love you guys. Thanks for being with us. And until next time.
Next week we'll be in Colorado.
We will. We're taking a trip. So we're going to allow our microbes to resonate in the new environment. And we'll tune in from there. Peace and love. Until next time.
Until next time.